Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So, welcome to the Citizen Science and Big Data portion of the eScience conference. My name is Chris Menzel, and I'll just be introducing folks. It's a diverse set of speakers today. Our first up is Carl Agozzi, and he's from University of Michigan, and his talk is on the utility of human-computer learning network for improving biodiversity conservation and research in eBird. Carl.
Or better known as improving the quality of citizen science data. Can you hear me if I speak at this level in the back? That's good. So I'm going to talk about both citizen science and big data. I want to talk about a project that was just funded 2 months ago. So you're going to see a lot of context and not a lot of results, but that's the way things go at this point of the game. It's a project I'm extremely excited about, and hopefully I'll get you interested in it also. The project is a collaboration between Cornell Lab of Ornithology, Oregon State, and Cornell Computer Science Department, and University of Michigan. There's Steve Kelling is the PI of the project. He's at the Cornell Lab of O, and I'll do my Cornell Lab of O advertisement. If you ever get to Ithaca, visit the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology. It's one of the most wonderful facilities that I know of. They do incredible work. And also I want to acknowledge all the eBirders, all the people who have contributed to eBird over the years. How many people know about eBird? Okay, so I'll fill in places. So let's sort of get the context here and talk a little bit about citizen science. And I put a couple of synonyms down there because people sometimes get deceived by citizen science, what it means, what I'm talking about. There's another set of terminology here, which is human computation. This notion of taking advantage of things that humans can do that machines can't do, and this collaboration between machines and humans. So we're all familiar with Mechanical Turk and other phenomena like this. So human computation is one nice way of thinking about it. Crowdsourcing is another way, although that's slightly inaccurate. And then Kevin Krausen at Syracuse, who's now at the NSF, has been calling it participatory scholarship. And I particularly like that because it's not just science. It's all sorts of scholarship. And we're not concentrating on just citizens. We're concentrating on the spectrum of different types of expertise to contribute to the scholarly effort. So I really like participatory scholarship, and I'm going to ban the term citizen science pretty soon from my talks. So there's a bunch of really good examples out there that I think some of you might know about. The ESP game, some of these are game-oriented. They're getting people to do activities that are fun, like playing games and contribute to things. ESP game is a game where you do label images, fold it, protein structures. Galaxy Zoo is a really well example and part of Zooniverse, doing galaxy classification. And reCAPTCHA is my favorite example, doing sort of security in entering sites in OCR at the same time, OCR of hard text at the same time. How many people know that you use reCAPTCHA? Yeah, so when you do those sort of difficult things that you figure out, enter these letters, you're helping OCRing these ancient texts, which machines have a hard time doing. So the project we're talking about here takes advantage of a really unique and interesting activist participatory community, which are birders. And you may not know this, but birding is the largest hobby in the United States. More people register themselves as birders than any other hobby. And the unique thing about birders is that they are they come from all stripes. Conservative, liberal, young, old, men, women, et cetera. The demographics are pretty broadly stretched. And they're very enthusiastic about what they do. So the context of this is a project called eBird, which has been going on for quite a while, that is run by the Cornell Lab of O. And eBird I think has been going on for over a decade now. I have not been involved in it, so I don't know the exact background. And what's wonderful about eBird is the scale of it at this point. There's more than 100 million observations submitted. And those observations are grouped into checklists, and we'll talk about them in a moment. There are 85,000 contributors. They've cited 9,200 species in 220 countries. So this is a large effort. There's a lot of data going in here. There's a huge biodiversity database that's being built up on the fly by people doing something that's really fun for them. So the scale of this is pretty large. And as I note here, there's a huge amount of voluntary time built into this that's taking place all over the world. So the map is obviously a world map of places where observations are occurring. And you can see they're all over the world in every continent. This is a constantly expanding, and it's expanding at a very rapid rate. We're at the point where we're getting 2.5 million observations per month. And you can see the growth curve here from 2003 to 2012. What's interesting about the growth curve that's relevant to things in this talk is that originally eBird tried to appeal to the birders on the basis of what's good for society and conservation. They said, this is great, record your observations in eBird because it'll be good for the world and it'll help everybody. And it didn't take off very quickly. So they changed direction in the incentive mechanism and said to birders, here's all sorts of ways you can compete with each other and show how great you are and show you're number one. And boy, did it take off. So there's a lesson there in, people like to think they're altruistic, but they also like to brag about themselves. And birders love to brag about themselves. So let me give you a few examples. Let me give you a little picture of how it works for birders and how it is good for birders. So there are three things that make it good. It's very easy to use. It fits very much into their natural way that they cite things. There are tools in it for improving their personal skills and expertise. And as I said, it appeals to birders' benevolent competitiveness. Birders aren't killing each other to be able to be at the top of the list, but they really do love to be at the top of the list. So there are features in there that appeal to that. So this is what's called a checklist. This is the web interface. If you go to ebird.org, and this is what you see when you go to ebird.org, and you can see a few things on here. I know you can't see them, so I'll point them out. That upper square there says that I'm located in Washtenaw County at the Bird Hill Nature Area in Washtenaw County. I enter my location. My location can be a spot, it can be a range, it can be an area or whatever. So there's different types of locations, but I say where I am and at what time of day. And what's important about this is the set of species on the checklist on the left are tailored to where I am, okay? And we'll get into that a little bit more later. But it says to me, this scrolls up, so there's more species there. But the set of species that are shown on the checklist are tailored to time of year, time of day, location, which obviously makes sense to those of us that even know nothing about birding, okay? So I get the chance to enter these observations. Now, obviously, I may see something really weird. I may see an osprey in my backyard in Ann Arbor. That would be really weird. But, so I can put in, there's a checkbox there for show rarities, and I can even put in I can put in free-form species designations, okay? So it's trying to guide me to things that are most probable, but it's allowing me to enter things that are improbable, and we'll talk more about that in a second. And then it says to me on the lower right, are you submitting a complete checklist of the birds you were able to identify? So we're trying to get a situation of negation here. Have I reported everything, or have I just reported casually? And if I say I reported everything, then we can sort of make some conclusion that there were no warblers at that site that day. Okay, so you get the gist here. So this is a checklist. It's very easy for birders to use. It's very natural. It's very easy for even Carl Lugosi to use. Okay. And then, if you have an iPhone or an Android device, you can use the app for that. So you can now, with the advent of mobile devices and mobile internet, you get this great situation in which these kind of things can be entered easily from those devices. So once you do data entry, you have a whole bunch of different things you can do, which are really wonderful for an individual birder. So they can explore where the birds are in their area, what birds are in their area, what their individual track count is, what other people are citing. So for example, this here is a list of birds in Washtenaw County, where I'm located in Ann Arbor, and their frequency over the years. So you can see on the left-hand side are a bunch of species, then there's time of year, and then there's the number of birds that were cited. So I can go all over the world. You can go anywhere in the world and do this where there's sightings, and you get this absolutely wonderful data about what's going on. Now, if you're a good birder, you're really interested in seeing certain species. So I'm sitting here, I'm sitting in Ann Arbor, and I say, where can I see a golden-winged warbler? Now, I wouldn't know what a golden-winged warbler is if you put it in front of me, but that doesn't matter. And so I can see in a complete worldview, and you can see that they're highly concentrated in the eastern United States. So this is year-round, all years, full range. This is what happens in May, for example. If I'm sighting in May, these are where all the warblers are in May. And then I can narrow down. Here is centering on Michigan, where the sightings have been, what the hot spots are, where I might go if I definitely want to see one. And then lastly, I can say, well, I know about this wonderful birding area called the McGee Boardwalk. When were they sighted and who sighted them? And lastly, if I'm Ken Kaufman, I can see what I've cited, okay? So I appeal to my ability to want to get knowledge, and I appeal to my competitiveness, all while I'm having fun as a birder. So this is a really great facility, and this takes advantage of this fabulously huge database of biodiversity information. So this is all well and good, it's all fun, but is there good science coming out of this? And that's what we're concerned about in this conference, and that's what I'm concerned about as a scientist myself. So there's absolutely fantastic science coming out of this. And the science is happening because all of this data is going into a well-organized database which has information, which has tables of location, observers, events, species, etc. So there's a really nice, huge database that's available to the public for querying and using. And out of that database comes things like being able to see the seasonal occurrence of birds. So these are the seasonal patterns of occurrence of indigo buntings during 2011 in the United States. And you can see, you can get maps like this. Whoops, let's not make it go that fast. There's May 21st, there's June 21st, as they start to move backwards, August 9th, et cetera. So these are available for every single species. And you can see every single species that's been recorded in eBird, and you have these wonderful occurrence maps, and you can start to figure out what are endangered areas, what are areas that are important to these birds. And obviously you see very, very different patterns as you look at different birds. So you get some really great science out of that. And out of that great science comes really incredible studies and really wonderful conservation efforts. So the first one I'll point out is the State of the Birds report in 2011 that the lab submitted to the Bureau of Public Lands, that was contracted by the Bureau of Public Lands and Waters. So here's the scientific question, the conservation question. The US government controls a large swath of land in the United States under different agencies. What can the US government do as a landowner to preserve certain species? What species rely on lands that are within the purview of the United States? What are within the purview of landowners? Which agencies are the ones that are most responsible for plots of land that certain species are dependent upon? So if you can say that the BLM, for example, the Bureau of Land Management, controls a swath of land that a certain species is very dependent on, we can have public policy that comes off of that. So it's a really wonderful set of questions. And here's some results of the study. This is the United States with the distribution of public lands, and you can see that there's, on the lower right-hand side, is the Bureau of Land Management, the Department of Defense, the National Park Service, and they all control different swaths of land, of course, mostly in the western United States and Alaska, but there's a lot of implications of that. You can overlay the bird distributions on that map and figure out, for example, where certain birds, like arid land birds, such as the Gunnison sage grouse, are distributed, and the fact that they're distributed mostly on BLM lands, we can actually do something to save an endangered species with a change in public land policy. So you get these absolutely wonderful types of things for every species of what can we practically do within our policy mechanism and land use mechanisms in the US to save certain bird species. And here is, for mountain bluebirds and willow flycatchers, the agency breakdown of responsibilities for birds over a year-wide scale. So the x-axis is a year, the y-axis is the percent in US public lands, and the colors are the stewardship, who has stewardship, the BLM, the DOD, the National Park Service, the Forest Service. So you can do really fantastic things here. This is a very effective report, and it really changed some of the shape of some public policy. Another interesting study that comes out of this great database is being able to do things like, say, where should we do wind turbines? So we all know that wind energy is catching on. We all think it's a wonderful environmental thing, but it also has this serious problem that it disrupts bird migration patterns. So they did a study in New York State of helping the state figure out where to allow wind sightings wind turbine sightings based on the habitat of birds. So this is all great, and I've told this sort of glowing story. The glowing story is mediated by the fact that there's a serious problem here that we have to address with citizen science or participatory science, which is quality. There are some people who do great birding, and there's people like me who can tell a pigeon from a blue jay, and that's about it. So we have to be very careful about the quality of this data. And there's a wonderful thing on the eBird site about eBird data quality that you can read, and it talks about the importance of being a careful observer. And it talks about using human vetters to vet the birds, vet the sightings. So what happens now is that every sighting that falls outside what's sort of the standard set of things that are reported goes to human vetters to figure out whether it makes sense. And you must realize that that is, of course, unscalable. So what our project is to enhance the effectiveness of citizen science by addressing the quality problem. So the first thing we want to do is the data filters for those checklists are rather primitive at this point. They don't really take advantage of the wealth of the database. So we want to improve the data input filters to limit erroneous data submission. We don't want to list things on the checklist that really don't make sense. We want to help guide people be better birders. We want to be able to identify the variation in observability. We want to figure out who's a novice, who's an expert, how to make the novices better birders, and how to make the experts more expert and teach each other. And lastly, which is a really big problem that we have to solve, is spatial bias. It's sort of intuitive that New York City has a huge amount of bird sightings, and some weird place in southwestern Kansas, where very few people live, has very few bird sightings. So we want to get more data into the system that's more spatially distributed. And the way we're doing that is through what we think is a very innovative thing, which we call a human-computer learning network that takes advantage of active learning. So we take advantage of active learning on two dimensions. One, on the human dimension, we help guide the human. We use the machine to guide the humans to do things that might help their birding and might help our data. You might tell them that they might want to go to a different site. And birders love to go to new sites where they can be the first to report on the checklist. So we're appealing to their motivation to be better birders and to wander more by guiding them to where we need data. So that's active learning number one. And then we do active learning from the machine learning point of view, which is an iterative technique to improve the training set, to improve the learning algorithm. So we guide the data input to help improve our own machine learning techniques. And there's a feedback loop here that takes advantage of a lot of different things called like emergent filters and an ODE model, which I'll talk about in a second. So again, we've got this iterative cycle of the machine guiding the human guiding the machine guiding itself by guiding the human, and hopefully our database and our knowledge improves over time. So let me talk a little bit about emergent filters. Again, what we want to do is we want to eliminate erroneous observations by not putting things on checklists that are improbable. We want that checklist really to be tailored to time, place, person, and the thing you all must realize is that given climate change, things are changing rather quickly about what birds are possible to see in certain areas. Last winter in the United States, because of the odd winter in the eastern United States, there were some really weird bird sightings which actually made sense. So we want the database to be able to react in real time, the machine to react in real time to generating those checklists. So we do these frequency of occurrence filters generated from the data to delineate what species can be reported in a region, and then we flag unusual observations. So we want to improve that method to be able to flag them automatically and feed them back and only vet those things which are absolutely necessary and have the machine do as much as possible and the humans do only things that are necessary for them. So that's technique number one. The second one is to address the observer variability by something we call an ODE model. So actually, the probability of seeing a bird is based on lots of variables, and they fit into three categories. One is the probability of occupancy of the site by a particular species, which are based on a whole bunch of environmental covariates describing that site. So there's environmental aspects that influence the quality of the observation. There's something called the ease of detection covariates. There are certain species that are really easy to spot. Great blue herons, even I can spot. They stand out very strongly. There are other birds that hide in the underbrush. So we use the covariates about that to affect our decision about whether it makes sense. And then lastly, we throw in the observer expertise variation based on the number of checklists submitted, how far they wander, what number of errors they have in the past. And all of these covariates together help us to decide whether the birder is good or bad and the observation makes sense or doesn't make sense. So there's some fairly advanced machine learning techniques going on here. And then the third thing that I talked about a little bit is improving the spatial coverage. So this is a map of sightings in New York State. And the white spaces are where there have been no sightings. And you can see central New York around Ithaca is really, really a big, big sighting place. And obviously down around Manhattan and New York City. The Adirondacks, where there's in the northern quadrant of the state, where there's a wonderful variety of birds, has very few people that are sighting there. So what we want to do is guide people and appeal to their instinct to be better birders and be top of the list and be the first one to spot a certain bird in Blue Mountain Lake in the Adirondacks and work on that notion. So lastly, and this is the work that we're doing in Michigan, because we're concerned about people rather than just algorithms, is we want to measure the impact of this on citizen science. We really want to take advantage of this database and see how these methods are helping make better birders. So we're trying to look at things like, do people's expertise actually improve over time? Do we actually influence people to be better birders, or are we discouraging bad birders? I mean, you certainly don't want a system where novice birders feel like idiots and give up on the whole thing because novice birders are potential expert birders. Do we really encourage greater geographic distribution of observations? Do we really encourage people to wander more and go more places? Are we educating them? And how do things change over time? What is the trajectory of a birder over time? And these are really great studies because although citizen science has been studied somewhat, really good studies of how the user behaves, of what their behavior is under these systems have not been done yet. And it's a great database. So I'm really looking forward to that. I should point out before I open it up for questions that there's a lot of really interesting implications of this work in lots of areas. One thing that I've been thinking about recently is there's an active movement in the United States for what are called learning health systems, to build advanced health databases that are based on crowdsourcing and expert input. There's quality issues written all over that, and I'd like to see these applied there. So with that, I'll open it up for questions, and thank you for your time.
Oh, here, we got one.
Great talk about a great project. Andrew Trelaw from the Australian National Data Service.
Oh, I know you.
No, you really don't. So I guess there's, thinking about that human-computer learning interaction, there's the underlying idea of using the computer and the human to inform one another in those ways. And there's the specific ODE model that would apply only in particular kind of field settings, if I can put it like that. So it's a two-part question. Do you know of anyone who's trying to generalize ODE to other kinds of observations, observation of plant species, for instance? And secondly, if you strip out the ODE model, do you think you could still use the human-computer learning approach for other domains of participatory scholarship, given that we're no longer allowed to say citizen science?
Well, I think the ODE model is generalizable. The covariates there are parameterized. So I think that any observational science has the notion of observer variability, ease of detection, and environmental factors, or contextual factors. So I think it is, and the person who's working on this is Wang Hung at Oregon State. And we have our first meeting, and I have yet to meet him yet, so I'll ask him that direct question of how much he's generalized it. But I believe, the notion of an observation is a pretty basic scientific abstraction. And I think those covariates exist all over that space. So, all right.
This is just a question about whether you considered, since you're calculating the probability of error for each observation, as someone that uses these sorts of data further downstream, I think with modern Bayesian methods, we could actually use that. So the people that are actually using these data, rather than relying on them being kind of perfect or pretending they're perfect, can actually make use of that data. So I would encourage you to, as well as filtering out some of the data, because it's obviously bad, I think it might be interesting to actually pass those probabilities right on, so to not present the observations as ones or zeros, but present them as an observation with a probability all the way at the end. And I think then we could probably, downstream correct for those errors in the modeling itself.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and it's one of the things we've been talking about, actually. At this point, the database does not record that information downstream. And I think that is, because I think that there are not novices and experts and good observations and bad observations. There are shades of difference in between, and there's a set of interesting work to be done there. Hi.
How do you validate location information? I mean, there's one problem, but people got to identify the right bird. But there's also errors that people can make in knowing where they are.
Well, I could give you the flip answer that that'll be all solved in the future when everything comes in from a smartphone.
Right.
I mean, that's the future answer.
Right.
The validation is, you're right. There's not any way to perfect. I mean, in the end, if someone says they saw an osprey in their backyard in Ann Arbor, we're not going to believe it unless they can show a picture. So there's really, we can only catch this stuff at the outer ends of the spectrum. But yeah, I mean, we're basically relying on trust, and we're flagging stuff which doesn't make sense.
I guess this wasn't a question about trust. It's that in a lot of data sets, there are navigational errors as well as observational errors.
Right. The only thing that one of the things that overcomes this is the volume of the stuff coming in. So that most people do know where they are and where they're doing something. And so if you have most people doing it's a classic crowdsourcing type of situation. You have some things that just don't make sense, but it's overwhelmed by the things that do make sense.
Hi, Carl.
Hi.
Following up on this point about the non-binary nature of the quality of these observations, in Seafloor Explorer and in the expert annotation work that led up to the development of Seafloor Explorer, by analyzing the variance between annotators, we discovered that they were very consistently biased. Each annotator is consistently biased. So they will repeatedly be biased in the same way, and so you can correct annotators' annotations by measuring their systematic bias.
Right.
So that's one thing it seems like you're positioned to do with your data set.
Which we are.
Right,
Every observer's got a login ID, and we can take a look and see where their biases lie. And that's actually one of the things that we're studying that, we're using that in the machine learning algorithms. I want to report on that in the actual user behavior about the prevalence of bias and do some correlations between that and perceived expertise level.
Excellent. And then so the follow-up is about ground truth, in that it seems like there are new sources of ground truth coming up besides the annotator or the citizen scientist or what have you. Birds will have smartphones eventually, in effect, right? There's going to be sensors on these birds, and suddenly you'll be able to ground truth your observations, right?
Well, there's a great new user interface problem there to design smartphones that birds can use, right? Yeah, I think it's a little bit far in the future when every bird will have a smartphone or a sensor attached to them. It'll be a long time in the future before sensors are able to identify birds. And I think that the problem we have now is there is no ground truth. There's too many locations, too many times of day to be able to get ground truth, and that's why we do this approach. And that's one of the things about this kind of citizen science, which is not true of other types of things like recapture and things like that, which there is sort of ground truth. You can have a gold standard. We can't have that in this world. So, but I think your point, I think there's a lot of changes on the horizon based on the ability of sensors to do things. Yes.
One more question, then we're going to move on.
So, can you, in the way the birders make observations, could you ask a question about how certain they are about the observation? I imagine that you see a blue heron, it's a blue heron, but if you see something dashing between branches and you think you know what you saw, could some self-expressed uncertainty be useful?
I'm trying to remember on the checklist. I'm ashamed to admit that I've done about 3 checklists in my career here. I think on the checklist there is no facility for saying
There doesn't seem to be.
level of certainty.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting, I mean, all of these things are in consideration with the project to be able to modify this. Okay. Well, thank you. I wanted to end by saying this is a project that I'm really, really excited about. I think it has great potential, and I look forward to coming back and reporting results. Okay? Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Carl. Let's give him a last round.